in the Heart of Longhorns podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Emmy, with our standing host, Michael Ween, the Stat King himself. What's up, man?
Huge night for SEC football. The day a lot of people have been waiting for since it was announced that Texas and OU were going to be moving to the SEC. The opponents for the 2024 SEC football schedule have been revealed, including Texas and OU. And on today's episode, we're going to be reacting to Texas's opponents, giving our thoughts on the SEC schedule going into 2024 as a whole, as Texas will join the SEC July 1st of next year, going into the first fall that they play this first annual schedule in the SEC. So let's start with your thoughts, Emmy. Couple quick things. As you notice in the lower third, Texas got rewarded with 4 home games. All of them pretty big. I mean, Mark Stoops has that Kentucky program running at a pretty good level, pretty consistently. They're winning 8 games-ish every year in the SEC, which is great for that program. Mississippi State goes in cycles, but they can be really good. It would have been a lot tougher if that game were in Starkville. I'm happy it's at Texas. And then the 2 big ones that everyone's going to be talking about until these games happen, hosting Florida and then hosting the big dog, no pun intended, in college football, Georgia, the 2-time defending national champions. And they keep their rivals on the schedule. Arkansas, that rivalry is renewed as Texas will travel to Fayetteville. We all remember what happened when Texas went there 2 years ago. It wasn't pretty. They will also renew the rivalry with Texas A&M, and they will travel to Vanderbilt, and they will keep, of course, the Red River rivalry as a neutral site game. In the non-conference, they will play Michigan in Ann Arbor. But for today's sakes, we're just going to talk about the SEC part of this. What are your main takeaways when you look at this set of opponents for Texas going into 2024?
Well, this is where the big dogs play. I mean, no pun intended, as you said, but seeing it all on a list like this, you can see why the SEC fans and people around the SEC always talk about how tough it is to go through that gauntlet of games late in the year. Typically, from week 4 onward, you got a run of SEC opponents, and Texas is going to be tested. We've seen Texas, have good stretches of football, like at the start of this past year, and then falter for injuries or whatever the case may be. In the SEC, there's going to be less room for error. The Big 12 is one thing. There's a different style of play there, absolutely. But for Texas, the biggest thing is, can they adapt quickly? That's really the question. We saw Texas A&M when they went to the conference. It was all rosy at the beginning. They had Johnny Manziel. They were winning games, but Texas A&M, they never were able to have that consistency since then. They've had good teams here and there, but have, for one, not been college football playoff contenders like Texas wants to be, and 2, just has been a turnstile when it comes to quarterbacks. So if Texas wants to be successful in the conference, they're going to have to be fully committed and mentally prepared.
Well, first thing is we have a ton of time to talk about what Texas needs to do in order to be successful going into their first year in the SEC. We have about a year and a half to talk about. Well, not a year and a half. We have about 10 months. No,
About a
14 months to
year.
talk about that.
Yeah.
14 months to talk about that before fall camp starts going into 2024. There's a lot of factors that go into how successful Texas will be. I mean, we know that Quinn Ewers will probably exit Texas after this season, given that they have a good year. He'll enter the draft. Who's it going to be entering that first year in the SEC? Is it going to be Malik Murphy or would it be Arch Manning? Would they have a true freshman quarterback or a redshirt freshman quarterback starting? Or would they have Malik Murphy in there who's been in the program, for 2 years, but still hasn't gotten a lot of playing time, but flashed himself in the spring game? The one thing I will say, though, is Texas has, for the past 3 years, Texas has been recruiting at an SEC level, especially in the trenches where it matters the most. Although the offensive line recruiting especially has been awesome with Kyle Flood in there as the offensive line coach and co-offensive coordinator. They've been recruiting at an SEC level. And finally, a lot of the fat from those Tom Herman rosters have left. And by the time they enter the SEC, it's going to be entirely Sark's guys, whether those are guys that he recruited or guys that have come in via the transfer portal. And we've seen that not only is Texas starting to dominate and put a fence around Texas and steal guys from A&M and steal guys from Oklahoma when Oklahoma wants to come down and poach the big-time recruits in Texas, but they've been able to go to California. They've been able to go to Florida to get big-time running backs. They're recruiting nationwide now at a high level. So the recruiting box is checked, and that will need to continue as recruiting for 2024 really ramps up here coming up in July. But they had the quarterback situation set. They've been recruiting at an SEC level. Tom Herman guys will mostly be gone by the time they enter the SEC. So I'm pretty confident that the culture is turning over and becoming better. The question will be, I think it's all on Sark. Sark's got to elevate these guys and develop them as a coach. But that's a whole nother discussion for another day. My main takeaways from the schedule, number one, I love that they gave Texas their 3 biggest rivals going into the SEC in their first year in the SEC. Now, it's not going to be easy because they get none of those games at home in their first year. They're going to have to go to A&M, which I kind of expected. It's no real surprise. They're going to have to go to Arkansas, once again, a place that, if we think back to 2021, was not kind to them. And then they're going to have Red River with Oklahoma. But the one thing I do like is only 3 SEC road games, true SEC road games in year one. That, I think, will benefit Texas a lot. And there's a lot of variables that can change between now and then. So we'll have to see how these teams actually line up and how viable they are. But only 3 SEC road games. I think the importance of that Oklahoma neutral site game becomes elevated for both teams, given that now, instead of playing the 9-game Big 12 schedule, you're playing a really good team that could beat you every single week, and teams that have equal to even better talent than you do. In the Big 12, although Texas and OU may not win all their games, they have more talent than the teams that they're playing. That no longer is the case with some of these SEC teams. So I think overall, the SEC did a great job. Me personally, I wanted the 9-game schedule where you get 3 permanent rivals every single year that you play every single year. You just rotate home and away, and then you rotate the other 6 SEC opponents, every couple of years. I would have preferred that format, but for the 8-game schedule format, I think the SEC absolutely nailed it. I love how they gave both Oklahoma and Texas a marquee home game year one in the SEC Texas gets Georgia. Oklahoma will host Bama. And I love that, I think it worked out. I think
Right.
this is as balanced as it can be for an 8-game conference schedule, although I personally would have preferred the 9-game conference schedule. But, I think in a couple years we could see that. I think that's definitely on the table still. They're just going to do some testing with the 8-game schedule first, and then it's going to be an experiment for the first couple of years that Texas and OU join the conference.
Right. Yeah. One thing I wanted to point out is a thing where Texas got a good end of the stick here is travel. If you think about it, Michigan is going to be the only opponent where they got to travel a significant distance. All of their other opponents, you're going to Vanderbilt, you're going to Texas A&M, you're going to Dallas to play Oklahoma, you're going to Arkansas. You're not going too far
Right.
outside of Texas state lines, which is a big positive for Texas.
Yep.
If you think about the Big 12 schedule, every other year you're going to West Virginia, you're going to Iowa State, you're going to, whatever the case may be, you're going all over the place. So I think that was a big W for Texas in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that applies to Texas's upcoming 2023 Big 12 schedule with the new teams that have been added with Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, and BYU. The only 2 true road games that Texas is going to play this upcoming year for the last year in the Big 12 outside the state of Texas are at Bama that second week of the season, which will be a challenge, and then at Iowa State near the end of the season. All the other games are going to be on the road, but within the state of Texas, because that OU game is in Dallas. They might go to Baylor, they might go to Houston, but they're all within Texas state borders. And you make a great point here. Texas, for the next couple of years, travel cannot be an excuse for underachieving. But those environments, Arkansas, A&M, and even Vanderbilt, with the hatred that these schools have for Texas as a whole, it's not going to be easy. So Texas is definitely going to have to build up that endurance going into the SEC, change their mindset from Big 12 play. It's got to be a more physical style of play, a more disciplined style of play. There's going to have to be more adjustments and more timely adjustments coming from the coaching staff. They're going to have to get much better quarterback play if they want to compete at a high level in the SEC. But another thing that I think benefits Texas is, remember, 2024, it's no longer a 4-team playoff. It goes to a 12-team playoff, which I think could be good for Texas because now, instead of potentially one loss and you're out of it, you can afford 2, maybe even 3 losses. Like, I think a 9-3 Texas team that played an SEC schedule like this could sneak into a 12-team playoff, where I don't think that's the case. That's definitely not the case with the 14 playoff. So, and even if, they're 9-3 and they're on the bubble of making the playoff, you have some more room for error, considering that you're playing a much tougher strength of schedule and there's more teams that can make the playoff. And when we really think about the 12-team playoff, you got to believe that there are going to be at least 4 SEC teams in there every single year. It's just how it's going to work. So I think if you're Texas, you look at your schedule and you say, okay, 4 home games, can we win 2, maybe steal one of the Georgia or Florida games? Can we win, 1 or 2 of our away games? Can we beat OU? And then, you get the 3 what should be cupcakes, and then you get that road game at Michigan, which will be tough. But there's an avenue where I can see this Texas team with good quarterback play and the quarterback room that they have and the incoming talent that they have and the work that they do in the transfer portal, there's an avenue where you can definitely get to that 9-win mark, which could put you in the conversation for a berth to that 12-team college football playoff.
Right. Especially with this strength of schedule, as you said. One thing I'll mention is that the good thing about Texas being great recruiting interior O line talent is they've clearly like strategically done this so that when we go to the SEC, our team will be suited for that style of play. And I think even in past years, our team has been more suited for SEC play than Big 12 play in certain ways. If you think about that linebacker room in certain years, you think of big run stoppers, right? And then you see a lot of times in the Big 12, you go and you play Garrett Patterson, you go and play Mike Gundy, those little speed running backs or whatever the case may be, speed wide receivers. Speed kills in the Big 12. So much space on the field, so much great offensive scheming with the spread offenses. And that has killed Texas for years. So going into the SEC, going into a more physical style of play, more running the football, more old school football, that's going to suit Texas.
Yeah, I think so. And look, they have another year in the Big 12 and another cycle of recruiting before they enter the SEC to really beef that up more in the trenches. Because at the end of the day, that in quarterback play goes a long way. Your offensive line, your quarterback play, and your run game in the SEC, it goes a long way. The skill positions take care of themselves. But we have a ton of time to discuss what Texas needs to do to succeed, and we'll sooner rather than later find out the order in which these games will be played. I think how the schedule actually shapes out. We know they'll probably be going to Michigan the second or third week of their season. We know they're going to have like a layup non-conference game like a ULM or New Mexico, whoever it may be, as like a break in their SEC schedule, which will benefit them, and that'll be a home game. They get 2 other cupcakes, if you will, or should be fairly easy victories at home, which I do like. But the one thing I want to discuss before we wrap this puppy up is the overall SEC schedule as a whole. Do you personally agree with eliminating divisions, having this more balanced schedule where everyone plays everybody could make for more good games on a week-to-week basis? I think that's been one of my biggest knocks on college football is most weeks you get a marquee game or 2, maybe 3 on the really good weeks. But there have been weeks in college football in years past where there hasn't really been the marquee draw game that everyone wants to watch. And I think with this new SEC schedule and with the new Big Ten schedule that they came out with a couple of days ago with USC and UCLA joining the Big Ten, there can be more of those games on a week-to-week basis, which benefits college football. I like eliminating divisions. That's my stance on it. What is your stance on it?
I completely agree. I think my theory with college football is that we're moving towards 2 big conferences. I don't know if it's going to be like that with other sports, but college football specifically, I think the Big Ten and the SEC are going to take over. I'm not sure where Clemson and those ACC schools are going to fit into this, but the SEC and the Big Ten are the ones with the most lucrative TV contracts. They're the most profitable conferences out of the Power Five. So I think those are the 2 that are going to be poaching more and more teams as the years go on. And then eventually it'll be two powerful conferences and then possibly a singular super conference. So the more, we combine, you know, schedules, the more teams we can see play each other, the better. With the NFL, they know who is going to be playing who each year beforehand, so they can strategically line up the schedule to make it so that you get at least a few marquee games or great games each week. And with the SEC going to no divisions, they're going to be able to do something more like that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm totally in favor of eliminating divisions. I believe they're going to do it in the Big Ten as well. I could be wrong on that, but I believe they're going to do that. So that is good. What about keeping the 8-game schedule? The other proposed format was a format where you play 9 SEC games every year. So it's an extra SEC game on the schedule, and you don't get that extra freebie on your schedule. But you get 3 permanent rivals every year for Texas. That obviously would be Arkansas, A&M, and OU. The OU game would stay at a neutral site. The Arkansas A&M games would rotate home and away. And then the other 6 teams would vary on a year-to-year basis. Or are you okay with keeping the 8-game schedule? And which do you think benefits Texas the most?
I'm in favor of the 9 game schedule personally. The first team that I thought of when I heard the idea of a 9 game SEC schedule was Oregon, actually. And let me tell you why. What happens every year in week one? Oregon plays an SEC team and they get smacked. And then they're out of the playoff discussion because they got smacked by an SEC team. So that's one less time Oregon has to deal with. But in all seriousness, I think the more SEC teams we get to see play each other, the better. As I said before, without divisions, without restrictions on who gets to play who each year, we just get to see more great matchups. Think about if say Anthony Richardson and Bryce Young had a duel last year. Like we we only got to see it, I think, once out of the 2 years they were starting quarterback. I don't think that's a great example, but you get the point. Or Alabama and Georgia, that's a perfect example. We only get to see that in the conference championship game. If we get to see that in the regular season, we wouldn't, we wouldn't have to, wait until the conference championship game.
Right. And speaking of Alabama, Georgia, we're going to get that in 2024 in the regular season. And we're going to get a ton of other great matchups. Before we go, I want to talk a little bit about OU's draw because Texas and it's not just Texas going to the SEC. OU is going to the SEC. And even though that we hate OU, we have to talk about them because they're linked with Texas. It's just the facts. So for OU, I'm going to pull up their opponents. They do get to host Alabama. They get to host Tennessee. And they get to host South Carolina. But they have 4 SEC road games their first year. Auburn, LSU, which will be fun, as that LSU program was in the SEC championship game a year ago. Brian Kelly has that thing rolling now in recruiting. When LSU recruits, watch out. Ole Miss and then Missouri. I think if you're Oklahoma, you're fairly pleased with that. I mean, you do get the one marquee home game in Alabama. You get maybe another marquee home game in Tennessee. I mean, Tennessee is a pretty good program nowadays. South Carolina with Shane Beamer as the coach. I mean, they're pretty decent. They're not just a rollover. You get the neutral site game with Texas. And then, your road games are tough. Ole Miss is always a tough environment. LSU is super tough. I mean, that's not a game I would be going into the SEC year one expecting to win, but I love that. I think OU LSU could become a really heated rivalry. And then we all know some weird shit has happened at Jordan Hare when teams have gone to Auburn.
Yep.
We've seen that year over year. So that's not going to be easy. Although Auburn is coming off a really rough year where they had to fire Brian Harsin and hire Hugh Freeze. That's something we still haven't talked about. We'll talk about that as we get closer to the season, the new coaching hires in college football.
Right. And you know what? Excuse our French, guys. We don't mean to cuss on this podcast. We're a family friendly podcast. But weird shit is actually the only word that fits for that.
Yes, it's the only word.
It really is.
Only word that you can use. So when we do cuss, it's not in a purposeful
Malicious way.
It's not in a malicious way. It's to emphasize something. So emphasize a point that we are making or an opinion that we have. It's not in a malicious intent. So closing remarks as we come up here on 30 minutes to wrap this thing up.
One thing I got to get off my chest. We did talk about OU because you know what? They're our main rival. And Aggie fans, we ain't finna talk about you ever. We don't care. Y'all are just a side piece. All right. OU is our main rival. Y'all are just gonna have to live with being our side piece. All right. That's all I gotta say.
All right. Good stuff there. A&M, they got a pretty decent draw, I have to say, but I think both of those rivalries are going to be once Texas and Texas A&M. We haven't seen it in a long time, so we just don't know. But once they get back together, I think it's going to become maybe not as heated as OU in Texas, since they've been playing every year, but it's going to be fun. The last time we saw those teams play, and I'll just leave you with this, possibly who is now to be considered maybe the greatest kicker in NFL history, nailed a game-winning field goal.
That's why he's the GOAT.
To win Texas that game on the road at Texas A&M, and that's the last memory that those teams have of playing each other. So, yeah.
Y'all got beat by Case McCoy, bro.
It's going to be interesting.
Case McCoy.
And it's going to be especially interesting if it's Arch Manning that is the starting quarterback going into year one in the SEC.
And you know what? I heard someone say this on the radio today. I'm not sure who it was that said it, but it was the idea that there's going to be a new appreciation around the rivalry now that we haven't had it for 10 years. And you know what? That is true, but once the game starts, all that's going to fade away. It's going to be on site.
Right.
And that's the way it's supposed to be.
The one thing that I will say is if you're Texas going into this year, you need to show that you can win on the road. Like winning, I don't think it's definitely not as a long shot as it was coming into last year. If you can win that Bama game week 2 in an SEC hostile environment, if you can find a way to steal that game and show the world that you can go into SEC environments and win, that would be huge for not only this team's confidence going into the SEC, but just overall showing that you can compete on the road. Because the past couple times you've gone on the road in an SEC environment, it hasn't been pretty. And that's really all we can speak to right now. I am worried a little bit, given Sark's track record at Texas, although it's only 2 years and we have to see more about this team's legitimacy sometimes on the road. We saw an ugly game when they went to Oklahoma State. We saw them lose at Texas Tech. I mean, there's a lot of work to do there, but that's fodder for another episode. So with all that being said, thank you guys for listening. If you like the Horns, leave us some feedback. Give us your thoughts on the Horns SEC opponents for their first year in the SEC. Give us your thoughts on whoever your team might be, whether it might be OU, whether it might be A&M, or another team in the SEC. What do you think about Texas hosting Georgia their first year in the SEC, as they could come into that game possibly as the 3-time defending champions of college football? There's a lot to discuss moving forward for college football. I'll be back soon with another Deep in the Heart of the Longhorns. And just like A&M's chances of avoiding Texas anymore, we are gone. Peace out and hook 'em
Peace out.
horns.
Horns up.